Good morning. This is Debbie Hart, the President and CEO of BioNJ. I'd like to thank you all for joining us today for our webinar on BioNJ's white paper, a framework for demonstrating the value of medical innovation. At BioNJ, our mission is to help our members help patients and to ensure that patients have access to the right medicines at the right time. And since our guiding words are "because patients can't wait," today's webinar gets to the very heart of who we are. Our white paper, which we released in June, was developed in response to a demand for a value measure that goes beyond whether a medicine saves money in the short term. This was raised by patients, advocates, payers, physicians, and industry members during our workshop series entitled Beyond Value Frameworks, Defining the Value of Medical Innovation over the last 2 years. The overriding concern was and is that traditional one-size-fits-all approaches to current benefits design often results in increased spending on low-value care while discouraging and reducing the use of more innovative and effective medicines. Ultimately, healthcare stakeholders are not interested in abstract discussions of value, but are interested in getting more value from the new medicines. So our paper outlines a framework for innovator companies to use as a roadmap to access and demonstrate differential value for their innovation, which includes engaging patients, physicians, and insurers throughout the process. Our authors, Dr. Shailja Dixit and Dr. Bob Goldberg, will walk us through the framework, focusing on how to identify, define, demonstrate, and capture the value of new innovation compared to the existing treatment landscape. So Dr. Shailja Dixit is the president and founder of Apex Bio. With more than 15 years of industry experience, Dr. Dixit has headed numerous successful global product launches and has led teams whose responsibility it is to develop end-to-end evidence to support market access and reimbursement. Meanwhile, Dr. Bob Goldberg is the vice president and founder of the Center for Medicine in the Public Interest. Dr. Goldberg's work focuses on generating reliable, real-world consumer-level evidence. So following Shailja and Bob's overview, we'll hear case studies from health policy experts who will share their firsthand experience in implementing such a framework. So our experts. First, Brian Gill is the founder and president of Gill Communications. Before launching Gill Communications, Brian spent 16 years with BioNJ member Celgene. Brian focuses on delivering potential new treatment options to patients with advanced cancers in order to extend and improve quality of life, while at the same time reducing the burden on our healthcare systems. And Leanne Lees is the Vice President, North American Head of Public Policy for BioNJ member Novartis. Leanne and her team have led Novartis's work with CMS on innovative pricing and contracting solutions for several recent product launches. Today, Leanne will share her perspectives on their approach and the lessons learned while implementing their strategy. And we thank them all for being with us. Before we get started, just a little housekeeping. So this is a listen-only webinar. We encourage you to submit questions, though, on the dialog box on your computer screen. So this morning, we have a diverse and record-setting number of interested healthcare stakeholders on the line, representing 11 states from Massachusetts to Florida and Connecticut to California, plus the District of Columbia. So we will try to get to as many of your questions as possible at the end of the presentation. If we don't get to your question during the webinar, we promise that we will follow up with you after the webinar with an answer. There will be a recording of this webinar on the BioNJ website at bionj.org beginning tomorrow. We invite you to review it and or share it. So now we're going to get started. It's my great pleasure to introduce our authors, Dr. Shailja Dixit and Dr. Bob Goldberg, to get us started.
Thanks, Debbie. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We began, Shailja and I, this effort on behalf of BioNJ to develop this white paper because we realized after 3 workshops that we held over 3 years with the patient community and with payers and others that the current market access journey is a race to the bottom, and not just for the companies, but for patients. That patients still face significant barriers to getting the medicines they need. And even though there's been a lot of research, hundreds of millions of dollars spent demonstrating the economic value of medicines and reducing total cost of care and improving productivity, patients with the most serious and complex conditions are still facing the greatest delays and out-of-pocket costs. But there's another element, which is that if we could wave away all those barriers and the drugs were free, there's still a problem with adherence and still people not using or benefiting from medicines even when there's for example, a genetic marker. So Sheldon and I asked ourselves, what if we could know, or the rhetorical we, to know in advance what medicines work best for patients, and what if we could identify the patients that would benefit from innovations but aren't because of adherence issues or life issues or et cetera. That information, that insight could be used to increase the value of medicines as well as demonstrate it. And Shalja, why don't we talk a little bit about the parts of our paper that actually show how to accomplish that.
Thank you, Debbie, and thank you, Bob. So over here, you will see on your screen, this is in our white paper, we outline four-pronged approach that pharmaceutical companies can adopt to demonstrate value of their innovation. To address these challenges as outlined by Bob and take advantage of new opportunities, pharma companies need to consider embracing models that identify value of innovation early on in drug discovery and build end-to-end evidence management that engages all stakeholders, internal stakeholders from R&D through commercialization, external stakeholders from healthcare providers to payers, keeping patients in center. More importantly, pharmaceutical companies no more have to do this alone. It's important to consider external collaborations and partnerships with healthcare systems and payers early on in this journey. Investing in smart and tailored real-world evidence and beyond the pill strategies from beginning of RX development may seem expensive and premature, but can lead to significant cost saving and can help understand patient journey and unmet needs early on. These are the two prongs as you see outlined in the slides, and we'll talk a little bit more about these two in our coming slides. Can we have the next slide, please? So a variety of factors today are increasing and accelerating the digitalization of large amount of data, as you see here, coming from a variety of sources. So it's no more a question of data, but we need to identify and leverage right analytics tool at the right time to unlock potential of this data. A right and proactive strategy can help not just in enhancing understanding the drug discovery and development, but can also lead to better market access. This valuable real-world data and strategy can be used to gain an understanding of disease, understanding of the real-world effectiveness of current treatment, and most importantly, understanding the unmet need of patients early on. Increasingly, the good thing is payers and healthcare technology assessment entities are looking at this data and studies that help support product value communication and how an intervention may impact system-wide cost and patient access, not just the disease itself. Last and most important, with increasing use of technology, patients are playing an important role in managing their own condition. And it's also changing the way they interact with healthcare system. You see here mHealth initiatives, social media, data from multiple applications and tools help understand patient and individual needs. In fact, comparison of efficacy that omits today patient-reported experience are no longer viewed as telling the full story. To get a full picture beyond the pill strategy is important. And with that, I want to hand it off back to Bob to talk a little bit more about beyond the pill strategy, Bob.
Sure. So we talk in the white paper that beyond the pill, which is everything you do to learn about the patient and how the drug is used outside of the traditional clinical trial, should be a business model. And by that, we don't mean that it's a source of revenue, it's really, we consider patient engagement almost as an active ingredient in whatever product is going to be developed. That patient engagement allows you to generate improved outcomes, measure treatment response, and also identify ways to optimize care once the product is approved. So in particular, and just to emphasize something that Shailja said a couple of minutes ago, leveraging real-time patient-level data to demonstrate and optimize outcomes is critical. Obtaining that data, we feel, is easier than it was even a couple of years ago. But it's also something that companies are going to have to invest in because of the limited bandwidth of payers and other systems to organize and extract data. But there's another element too, which is the inner lives of patients have been ignored in traditional research, whether it's clinical trials or pharmacoeconomic. And we can use social media to learn how the lives and feelings of patients affect adherence and outcomes. The last point I would make is that these insights can be used to track disease trajectories for every individual at any stage of the disease using machine learning tools, which we'll talk a little bit about. And the last point, which I think will lead Debbie and to our other panelists, is that these beyond the pill strategies, they don't have to be developed whole cloth. We can start by growing it organically from the relationships and approaches established to define and measure value early in the development process. And for more insights on how that can be done, Debbie, I'll turn it back to you and to the other panelists.
Terrific. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Shailja. So now we're going to hear from Leanne Lees and Brian Gill, and they'll provide insights into their respective experiences at Novartis and Celgene and beyond. So both Leanne and Brian will give us a behind-the-scenes look at, just how do you get this done, including how early in the process do you start, who are the stakeholders, both internal and external, what considerations are needed, what approvals are needed, and probably most importantly, right, the lessons learned after launch. So that's a lot to pack into just a few minutes, but I know they're up to the challenge. And welcome to Leanne, who's going to get us started.
Thank you, Debbie, for your introduction, and also to Shailja and Bob for their outline of the white paper. And the white paper identified and outlined an important framework for the approach that companies should be taking in preparation for product commercialization and seeking payment and reimbursement for their medicines. As discussed earlier, there are several different value assessment frameworks existing today here in the U.S. and different challenges with each of them. There is a new landscape assessment released this week by the National Pharmaceutical Council that stratifies the differences among them and identifies the needed improvements in each of the value assessment frameworks. Patient-centeredness, however, is a key need across all of them. At Novartis and all pharma companies, it is a long journey from early discovery and research work until final product development. And there needs to be significant dialogue throughout the multi-year journey to assess how patients and their caregivers, providers, and payers will define the value of a new medicine. How each of these stakeholders views value is very different and can also differ significantly across therapeutic areas. As Bob stressed earlier, patients and their caregivers have often been left out of these important discussions, and it's important to build them in going forward. So let me describe a little bit the process we followed in developing Entresto, our heart failure product, and preparing for its launch back in 2015, as well as how we've tweaked that process for subsequent products. So while we've had value discussions and payer dialogue earlier in development, at the conclusion of the phase 2 trials for Entresto, Novartis assembled a cross-functional team who designed a phase 3 trial intended to support specific outcomes deemed of value to stakeholders. And those outcomes were initially defined as the decrease in all-cause hospitalization, the decrease in heart failure hospitalization, and the reduction in mortality. And while this core, what we call a local products team, included medical affairs, health economics and outcomes research, market access, and regulatory colleagues, there were additional extended team members included, such as policy, communications, and financial colleagues. And all of these parties provided perspective and insight in defining and aligning on these three outcomes goals. Now, in the end, the FDA-approved label did not include the reduction in all-cause hospitalization, but did include the other two outcomes, reduction in heart failure hospitalization and reduction in mortality. So as a result, Novartis was able to clearly establish our value and structure specific measurable outcomes-based contracts aligned to the heart failure hospitalization metric. We worked with payers to then establish a clear data set that would be used to measure results against the outcomes goals, which took many conversations across different payers to eventually align on. Now, for both of our recent cell and gene therapies, Kymriah and Zolgensma, we began even earlier in the development process to understand the payers' and providers' insights and preferences on measurable outcomes. It's not always as easy to define an outcomes metric that is as clear as taking a blood test or measuring a decrease in cost. So allowing more time for this discussion and alignment is a critical lesson learned for us. And the work of incorporating value-based endpoints into clinical trials is happening earlier and earlier in the clinical design process as demonstrating that value becomes increasingly important to patients, physicians, and payers. Let's move to the next slide. At Novartis, we have evolved our principles for value-based pricing and value-based access for medicines. We believe it is important for all stakeholders in the healthcare system to be assessed on the basis of the value they deliver. And we believe it's important to accelerate society's shift to value-based healthcare. From a medicines perspective, we have 4 pillars that we follow in pricing a product that takes into account improvements to patients clinically, such as shrinking a tumor or reducing blood sugar or prolonging survival. Improvements to patients in terms of their quality of life. Benefits offered to the healthcare system, such as reducing the rate or duration of hospitalizations or the intensity of care. And finally, benefits offered to society as a whole, such as allowing a patient or caregiver to return to work. And if medicines are priced in this value-based manner, then we expect patients should have broad access with minimal benefit design barriers and, most importantly, reasonable patient out-of-pocket costs. And in this way, drugs that demonstrate value and are priced accordingly should be unhindered in their ability to deliver that value to patients and to society. All right, on the next slide, I want to point out that innovative pricing and contracting solutions are very important tools. And that's because the traditional pricing model that has always included a percentage rebate to commercial and Part D payers is really evolving. Innovative solutions are now expected on specialty pharmacy products, and especially for those cell and gene therapies. And so those can include different models, such as an outcomes-based contract with varying percentage of product cost at risk. Could also include indication-based pricing, where there are separate WAC prices for very specific and different indications that may have different impact to the healthcare system and to patients. And then long-term financing models that allow payment over time by the healthcare system. So while there are expectations for these types of models, there are barriers that exist that can limit the flexibility of these arrangements. Legal barriers, for instance, can include the anti-kickback statute, and also what specific outcomes that are included in an outcomes-based contract and whether or not those outcomes are in fact included in the product label. There are government price reporting barriers such as Medicaid best price, ASP, and AMP that can also limit implementation of these type of structures. And operational barriers exist and can include portability of the multi-year outcomes-based arrangements as patients navigate across the payer universe. for example, a patient moving from the Medicaid environment to commercial, how do you ensure that an outcomes payment is made to the appropriate payer if an outcomes metric is achieved after a patient has transitioned between payers? So portability being a key barrier to overcome. And then finally, last but certainly not least important, having ready access to the specific data that's needed to easily measure outcomes. Having clear alignment with the contracting parties on the measurement algorithm is critical to avoid uncertainty later in the measurement phase of the contract. So all of these barriers that I've identified are things that we've learned as we've now negotiated outcomes-based contracts over the last 3 products in Entresto, Kymriah, and Zolgensma. And so with that, I'll turn it back to Debbie now.
Great. Thank you so much, Leanne. Appreciate it. So, and now we're going to move to Brian Gill. And just a reminder that if you have any questions, we encourage you to enter them in the dialog box on your screen. They will magically pop up on ours here. We'll be happy to address them. But in the meantime, we're going to hear from Brian.
Thanks, Debbie. And before I make comments, I just want to make sure the audience understands that my comments reflect my own personal experience and opinion, and not the opinion of any of the companies that I talk about today, Celgene and Time Technologies. I retired from Celgene in 2018, and I'm actually working with Time Technologies today. So, you know, I believe that to make sure that this initiative is successful, at least from my personal experience, there's absolutely no room for silos in the organizations that are trying to help communicate these health economic outcomes. And sometimes the best way to make that happen is from even with global multinational companies, a centralized function like Leanne was sharing with you, and that the support is driven from the top down. So the message is really clear. You can have everybody participate, but you need a centralized function driving the initiative and driving the desirable outcomes, delivering on the desirable outcomes. The other thing that I think is important is that communications function needs to be built in to these initiatives, to the strategy and tactics very early on. Communication discipline should not be pulled in at the very last minute to help communicate talking points and things like that, but should be brought in at the very first meeting to maximize the potential of getting those messages across to the largest possible shareholders effectively. So to the question of, you know, how early in the process do you start? And my comment is you can never start early enough. You can really be a little radical in your thinking and do things differently. A lot of companies like to start in phase 3. A lot of companies wait until the product is delivered and is in the marketplace. But I think today the conversation around medical innovators delivering science, you know, excellent clinical outcomes, and innovative medicines that are helping people live higher quality lives and hopefully living longer, as well as reducing costs on our healthcare system and adding to the economy by putting people back to work, and you know, they generate income and they consume and they pay taxes and all that good stuff. You know, I think you start very early on, and my experience with Revlimid was, keep in mind, this was a phase 2 study for a disease state, MDS-del5Q, where there was no real treatment. The way patients were being treated was with transfusions. I mean, imagine that type of quality of life, where every week you go in for a transfusion to survive. And fortunately, with the discovery of Revlimid and the development of Revlimid, merely by taking a pill at home with a glass of water, we were able to change that treatment paradigm, give patients new hope. 2/3 of the patients were able to really respond from the therapy, you know, reduce deaths, and just give them a higher quality of life. So, you know, we did not have a health economic outcome study in place at that time to help the various stakeholders understand the type of value that was being created across the healthcare system, and most importantly, for patients. And even when you look at Revlimid as it moved into multiple myeloma, it was several years after the product was actually in the marketplace before people started paying attention to the importance of real-world data and communicating the value created by this therapy to our shareholders. And one of the biggest measurements that we focused on was the reduction in hospitalizations. I mean, that alone was very significant. And you'd see in later years, we were helping people to understand how this therapy significantly reduced the overall cost of treating the disease. And today I'm working with an emerging biotech company called Tyme Technologies. It's delivering next generation cancer metabolism-based therapies. And the lead product actually has shown clinical responses across 15 different tumor types, both solid and liquid tumors. So, some of the clinical data that we have to date is very encouraging. That has basically advanced the thinking of getting this therapy into a pivotal trial, which we launched at the end of September. And so now this cancer metabolism-based therapy is going to be offered to patients with metastatic pancreatic cancer, a real tough disease state, and very poor prognostic patient population. But we're committed to delivering hope and making a change, and that's moving forward. The product is also being studied in several other metastatic cancers, namely prostate, sarcoma, and hopefully in the near future, more. But I think one thing that Tyme has taken away from our biopharmaceutical colleagues is the importance in today that science just won't do it, clinical data won't do it. You need to help various stakeholders understand the value of creation of your therapy that's being brought to the marketplace, and how that is making a difference in putting people back to work, reducing healthcare costs, increasing quality of life, and obviously, hopefully on the efficacy and safety side. And then who are the stakeholders? Completely aligned with Leanne and Novartis on this centralized approach, multidisciplinary approach, no silo approach, advocacy, market access, policy, communications. That's the team that we had at Celgene. I'm sure as Tyme begins to grow, there will be a centralized approach there as well. It's very effective and efficient in communicating to stakeholders. And then it's important, obviously, to have the relationships with the trade organizations and patient advocacy partners as well. And then, the other comment that I would like to make is that earlier on I said about communications, you cannot communicate often enough with multiple studies, across the various stakeholders. As an industry, we change treatment paradigms with tens of thousands of abstracts at major international medical meetings. There is no reason why we can't change this outdated, archaic approach that we're witnessing today in accounting and budgeting for healthcare by doing the same thing. Now, it may not be tens of thousands of abstracts, but we should be talking about thousands of abstracts that reinforce the importance of medical innovation and its impact on lowering the overall cost of treating a particular disease. I would also suggest that there should be an independent repository where all these health economic outcome research studies can be deposited and make it just very transparent, so outside sources can come in, review the facts, and generate their own opinion based on the various studies that they're reviewing. So I think those are my main thoughts that I'd like to leave this audience with, Debbie.
Terrific. Thank you, Brian. Terrific. So now we will move into our Q&A session, now that we've heard those words of wisdom from our four speakers. And again, we encourage you to, if you have a question, enter it in your dialog box, and we will see it here, and we will be happy to address it. If we don't get to all questions before the 11 o'clock hour rolls around, we will certainly follow up afterwards. I do see a number of questions. Let's see. So how is your company overcoming silos to measure value with real world evidence? So Leanne, and then maybe Brian, you want to take that one?
Sure. Thank you, Debbie. Yeah, I mean, it's easy in a larger company, Novartis or other companies, for silos to exist, certainly on this issue and many others. I think we're divided into different divisions, and specific divisions can get very focused on, their specific product launch and how to support, the value of that product. But we've been able to raise this issue in priority above the division level and really align across the business and across geographic markets on our approach to how we like to measure product value. And so that has been helpful to prioritize it to a more senior level and get senior leadership alignment on our approach.
Debbie,
Thank you.
Debbie, from my experience, it was important to have the board support, the chairman and the CEO's support, have a centralized group, in a committee where others can participate and obviously give input and have conversations both ways. But at the end of the day, people understood that this was very centralized. Celgene, when I was working with Celgene, had about 8,000 employees, was operating in about 60 countries. It's easier said than done, in my opinion. And I think part of it is also a reflection of the company's culture and how you manage that culture and the company's values worldwide. Hopefully with a company like Time Technologies, which is emerging, has a clean slate that you learn early, and you can build these values, cultures, and initiatives into the company and its leadership early on.
Great. Thank you, Leanne. Thank you, Brian. Another question. So how are outcomes measures being developed and when? Sounds like one. Maybe Xiaozhi, you want to start us off?
Sure. Thank you, Debbie, and thank you for the question. We are doing a good job as industry to think and include outcomes measures early on during our development. I think Leanne walked us through a very nice case study where Novartis has used, and I'm seeing this around with many companies, outcomes measure discussion at least starting as early on as phase 1, and definitely been included in pivotal trial in phase 3. We are also seeing specific outcomes related trial designs, which are phase 4. And there are a variety of outcomes measures that we are talking about. The classical ones are clinical outcomes, utilization-based outcomes. Good example from Novartis, again, I'll refer back to around, hospitalization and rehospitalization. More importantly, these days we are seeing more and more use of patient-reported outcomes, which in my mind are one of the most important ones and the new ones which industry is adopting. What we need to do a little bit better job of including these patient-reported outcomes beyond our pivotal trials. So when the drug is launched, how do we include these outcomes measures and constantly measure them beyond our launch time? But I think we are there. We are getting there as an industry. Great.
Yeah, I would agree. I would also add that I had a conversation with Scott Gottlieb just after he left the FDA, and I said, do you think you could get a drug or a device approved just on quality of life indication alone? He said, absolutely. And there's an openness in the regulatory community for doing just that. And it goes back to the import that we place on the patient engagement beyond the pill approach as a way for analyzing, capturing, and applying data. And those kinds of measures, which aren't captured in claims data or whatever, can be very valuable, not just for getting extended approvals, but also for demonstrating to the people in the trenches that there is a qualitative improvement that is being generated, and increasingly payers and health systems are on the hook for those qualitative improvements.
Thank you, Bob. Leanne, did you want to add anything to that?
Sure. I agree completely with Xiaozhi on the importance of the patient-reported outcomes being incorporated, and I think that that's something that across the industry we see a new emphasis on. I think, again, starting as early as possible and talking to as many of the stakeholders as possible is how you come to terms with the right outcomes measurements. But a key, I think, reminder is if there's not an easy way to measure it and find the data to, report on the measurements and what level of outcomes are achieved, then it doesn't matter how sophisticated and fancy we get with outcomes measurements. There has to be a data component and an operational plan of, how to measure going forward.
Great, thank you, Leanne. So another question. So there's been a lot of news about the growing role of ICER in the drug pricing process. ICER does not use real-world evidence in its analyses. Can you discuss the role of ICER and the debate about real-world evidence?
Well, let me just jump in and say that I think ICER is emerged in the apps because reality and life abhors a vacuum. In the absence of the kinds of things that we're talking about today, ICER becomes the default option. And I've actually spoken to a couple of payers and PBMs who have said, quite frankly, that they use ICER as a way of sort of holding off on approving medicines until the research and the real-world evidence of the impact in subpopulations is being developed. So all the more reason to begin to invest in this approach, because if you're able to demonstrate to a health system or a provider that you're improving outcomes, reducing costs on agreed upon endpoints, that's money in the bank. That's much more powerful than a one-size-fits-all hedge fund-driven, think tank trying to make a judgment on the value of a medicine.
Anyone else like to add to that?
I would just add to what Bob said. I think as an industry, we need to come together to have a framework where this real-world evidence and, more importantly, patient voice and perspective is captured. It is true that, unfortunately, when a lot of these assessments are happening by bodies like ICER, they don't have real-world data because they do it before the drug is launched. So I think it is our responsibility as an industry to come together and come up with a framework or collaborate with ICER or go back to them and tell them that, this patient-reported outcomes and real-world evidence need to be included.
Okay, we have lots of questions coming in here. So let's see. So Bob, how do you deal with the payer's dilemma that they pay costs in the short term, but may lose the patient to another insurer to benefit from an expensive technology? Could there be a requirement that patients stay with an insurer for a number of years after receiving innovative, expensive therapies with long-term benefits?
Well, I think that's a dilemma that all payers face. I think making a consumer an indentured servant to a health system is not the best strategy, but there are strategies that allow a payer to pay it forward, if you will, and these are already being discussed. I think in general, maybe Leanne wants to jump in on this because of the experience that Novartis has had, that the being able to demonstrate the improvement in the disease state or preventing disease is something that plans and payers are increasingly getting on the hook for, and it's a way of retaining patients. So if you deliver a good product and you're engaging the patients and develop loyalty to that, they're not going to want to leave. They're going to become, fans of Novartis or fans of Hackensack or fans of Kaiser, so to speak. So I think that's, again, all the more reason to begin to treat the patients as partners in this whole enterprise.
Yeah, it's Leanne. I would agree with Bob that putting the patient again at the center of this is very, very important, and understanding what's important to them, and their, again, measurements of success are going to be different than that of a provider or a payer. So it can truly be a differentiator, as Bob described.
Okay.
Debbie, it's Brian. You know, I know this may be a poor analogy, but look at other insurance companies, not health insurance companies. And so say that you have homeowners insurance, and a tree, you know, lands on part of your house, and the homeowners insurance company takes care of it without a question. You're very happy. But the following year, the customer service lags behind, or you've just increased your premiums substantially, and you move on and you find another, you know, homeowners insurance company. You know, I think that the dynamics are kind of similar. It's really up to the provider, and you know, I don't think we should look at other members of the healthcare system. You look at the healthcare provider and ask those questions. What can you do better to help these patients stay on board? And keep in mind, you know, most of the conversation today is around a very tiny patient population. And, you know, Bob, correct me if I'm wrong here, but, you know, those patients that suffer from chronic diseases represent, you know, 2% or so of our patient population, 3 or 4% of the overall prescriptions. You know, if it was reversed, I could see that as perhaps a sea change in the way insurers would manage healthcare, but it's a small number, and you know, I think this goes back to the provider.
Okay, thank you, Brian. So maybe, Brian, this is a question for you, if I may, and anyone else is more than welcome to comment on it. So how do you communicate the value of medical innovation to non-science departments such as HR or IT? And maybe, Brian, before I hand it off to you, I would invite folks to take a visit to the bioandj.org website. We have done a whole lot of work on our own, as well as gathering of what others are saying about the value of medical innovation on our website. And we have a number of initiatives on that front, and hopefully some of what we have there can be valuable to you. But with that, Brian, would you like to take a stab at this, please?
Yeah, no, and thanks for that question. That's such a critical question in the dynamics that we're dealing with today, and we are guilty as charged, not for lack of focus, in my opinion, but we're trained to be very scientific, very analytical, very data-driven, very academic, and those are the health economic outcomes reports that are generated on a regular basis, and very few people step up, and that's why I had mentioned bring the communications function or discipline into this initiative, into a medical innovation initiative early on, because that person should always ask, okay, great report, great outcomes, now answer the question, so what? And if you can't do that in 4 or 5 bullet points, then we have failed as an industry. And I think to Debbie's points, BioNJ is doing a great job in trying to distill a lot of that academic thinking into simple speak. And I would submit that whenever a health economic research initiative is being strategically mapped out, that an important tactic would be, and for lack of a better expression, maybe a patient summary, not an executive summary, but a patient summary, and that is simple speak for the patient and providers to understand, and to also help in that simple speak to say, as a result, and whether this is prospective or retrospective, X number of patients are going to be living longer, higher quality of life, we reduce the hospitalizations for this cost of this disease state by 70%. That means, and whatever the numbers, we can do a much better job in communicating through simple speak to these multiple stakeholders. I think that's a wonderful question.
Terrific. Anyone want to add to that? Okay. Okay. Let's see. This is an interesting, they're all interesting. This is a particularly interesting one. So how is the dialogue started with other nations' health systems that the research from which they benefit needs to be supported by more reasonable pricing? And can the approach that we've described also support what I see as a central message?
I can. It is really an interesting question. All of them are, as you said, Debbie. But in particular, having some experience launching products internationally. Actually, some nations, especially in EU and top 5 EU, as we classically say, they do have forums where you can reach out to what we call health technology assessment entities and gain their feedback early on, and understand what would be important measures to describe the value of innovation. And as we all know, in many of these countries, we have a classical modeling where you have to quantify a lot of these aspects to demonstrate the value and justify the pricing. So there are forums that do exist. I highly encourage companies and to talk to these HTA entities early on, and there are mechanisms to approach them. Absolutely, the framework that we have laid out in our white paper actually covers not just US, but international health systems as well, especially at least where we have HTA health technology assessment bodies that look through cost effectiveness, health economics, and patient-reported outcomes. I would just end with this, that there are some countries where actually patient-reported outcome has become, or their perspective has become absolutely mandatory to be included. And we have a lot of the drug approvals that were done as a first point from a patient perspective, and the second aspect being other entities around outcomes. So there are forums, and companies should be encouraged to do and leverage them early on. There has to be an operating model, and the framework we laid out, as I said, does include all of those.
Let me just add that a lot of the media attention goes to the UK model or the Canadian model or our UK wannabe model, ICER, in terms of measuring value in terms of quality. And really, in point of fact, is, as Shalja referred to, quality is not used in most health technology assessments. And increasingly, the average response and cost savings is being displaced by these nuanced approaches that differentiate patients based upon their preferences, their outcomes, and biomarkers. So again, using ICER as a default, we should be looking forward together with payers and other national health systems to develop an engagement framework that uses that real-world data.
Okay.
Yeah, Bob, and I think the other important thing, and I know it's difficult with a lot of work that we've done that I've done, working with my various colleagues in the past in the EU5, is if there was ever a time where you wanted to eliminate silos, it would be in that marketplace, because this accounting process, again, there's somebody that's responsible for and gets a budget, and he or she has to manage that budget for medicines, another one for hospitals and admin, and another one for doctors. And so you've got these silos that makes it very difficult from the beginning. And unless you can bring them all together to say, oh, here's a medicine that's reducing the cost of treating disease ABC by 70%, can the three of us get together and meet to say, here's how we should distribute or create the budget for this particular disease state?
And let me just follow up on what Brian said, that the framework that we put together in the white paper, is based upon this the trajectory that HCA groups around the world are moving, and their need, in fact, their demand, if you will, for real nuanced patient level data. There's an eye towards not just making coverage determinations, but also using this information to improve the responsiveness and the value of care at a national or regional level. So again, not to sort of yet another shameless plug, but please download our paper, read it. If anyone out there is a movie producer and wants to make a movie, Shalja and I have agents, and we're available for auditions. So.
Okay. So let's see. So what analytical tools are being used to determine and predict outcomes at the patient level and demonstrate value compared to standard of care? I think, Bob, that's probably for you.
Yes. Well, over the last couple of years, I've been focused particularly on developing tools, and this addresses some of the questions the patients had. Like, what does it mean to an individual patient? And what does it mean to an individual patient at a given point if they do or do not get a new medicine? That is something that machine learning tools are suited to analyze, because traditional models only allow you to look at one or two variables. And if you exclude all the other variables and other facets, then your model and prediction, you can't predict, and your models are incomplete. The second thing is that, and the FDA has actually been urging people in this direction, is that using social media in a de-identified HIPAA-compliant fashion, whether it's from the usual, online postings or the patient engagement platforms, can be used not just to generate spontaneous events for adverse events, but to identify what the barriers are to adherence. These are things that the FDA and payers are very, very interested in. And I'm telling you that the ability the best way to analyze it is to go beyond the current traditional approaches and begin to develop more causal and predictive models that can be used to design trials, to identify and optimize treatment in specific groups. And that's stuff that maybe we'll have another webinar about how to use those tools, but because it's a really very important element of what we're talking about today.
There you go. Next steps.
There you
Love
go.
it.
Yeah.
Love it. Okay.
Yeah.
Shalja? Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just add to what Bob said. We covered everything actually here. But as an industry, I think we have done and we have traveled a distance here quite a lot. In starting to use a lot of traditional patient-reported outcomes. We are getting there, and obviously there are a lot of classical analytics tools that we have started using. Where we need to do a little better job is, as Bob was pointing out, I think two kinds of patient-level data, which we are still trying to figure out as an industry, and adoption is quite not there. One is the social media. I'm not talking about Facebook, but as Bob said, there are other data that's available that patients report and talk about in their forums that we need to, and it's unfiltered data coming from what patients need and how they feel and what their behavioral aspect, which is really important to capture and understand, because we know as an industry, the biggest problem we have, and payers appreciate this, is around non-adherence, right? And that's looking at this data is where we get a good understanding of patient perspective.
Okay, great. Thank you. And a related question, actually, and appropriately, it comes from a patient advocate. So the point about a repository for HEOR studies is critical. As a patient advocate, it's vital that we have access to peer-reviewed literature, but for many of us, as well as nearly all patients, the cost of access is prohibitive. We can't competently comment on value assessment without access to this data. And I'd love to hear from the speakers comments on how patients and patient advocates could gain access to the data necessary to meaningfully engage in the value assessment process.
Oh, go ahead.
I think this is, we all will have some perspective about it, but this is really spot on. That is definitely, even for smaller biotech and companies, not just patient advocates. One thing is that I think more and more pharma companies are adopting open source literature. That's one thing. So with open source, we do have better access to a lot of these studies. Second thing I would say is consortiums like BioNJ, the paper we have, there is a ton of repository that we are collecting, and I believe that we're looking at you here, we'll be having more and more of those. Another third very interesting place is the patient advocacy group. I mean, I've worked with few of them, and they are providing a very rich repository for patients, advocate as well as patients, their families and caregivers to get some good information about innovation. Bob, if you want to add something to that.
I would just add that as the patient voice becomes more important, having access to the results of the research based upon those insights should be made automatically available to patients. And secondly, I mean, not all peer-reviewed studies are created equal. I would go beyond the question and say, and this is something that the Patient-Centered Outcome Research Institute has done I think a credible job doing, is saying we have to, if it's nothing about us without us.
Great. Okay, thank you. Maybe that is something that BioNJ will, a place where we could assist. So we will take a look at that. So maybe we'll give Leanne and Brian a moment to give us a last thought, and then we will bring it on home. So Leanne?
Thank you, Debbie, and thank you to the rest of the speakers. I think the importance of what we've shared today is that, you of course can never start too early in this dialogue, and you have to talk to as many stakeholders as possible, and seeing the access to patients and their caregivers and their perspectives on these issues being of utmost importance, in addition to talking to payers and providers and other interested parties. So that would be I think, lessons learned that I would emphasize from our perspective.
Thank you, Leanne. And Brian?
So I wanted to make a comment on that last question, which I thought was a very good one. And just a broad thought that, patients know where to go when they're looking for clinical trials, clinicaltrials.gov. Wouldn't it be interesting, and Debbie, maybe this is something for you, the valueofmedicalinnovation.gov. We'll see where that takes us. But to follow up with Leanne, yes, it's got to be a broad, in my opinion, it needs to be bold and sometimes radical to get people to understand there's policy, there's advocacy, there's room for some activism to move the ball sometimes, and to get people to look at things differently. We all know that change takes people out of their comfort area, particularly when they've been doing the same things for 10, 20, 30 years. And it's incumbent on us to be that group that helps people look at things differently, because at the end of the day, it's all about the patient and getting the right drug to the right patient at the right time.
Well said. Well, so thank you so much to all of our speakers, to Dr. Shailja Dixit, Dr. Bob Goldberg, Brian Gill, and Leanne Lees for sharing your time, expertise, support. We very much appreciate it. Again, a reminder that the webinar will be online tomorrow at bionj.org. Also, we mentioned some of the work that we're doing on the value of medical innovation. I'd invite you to visit bionj.org/VOMI to view and download the resources. Also, I'd invite you to visit our website again with a /protect medical innovation to learn more about our work on protecting medical innovation. You can actually sign up to help us on that front. We would very much like to have your voice mixed in with us. We're, looking at things like ICER and trying to protect against some of the damage that we believe that ICER can do. If you're not a BioNJ member, please join. I hope to see you at our C-Suite Summit on November 8th. Thank you to our speakers, and thank you to each and every one of you for joining us this morning and what you do each and every day for patients.